Welcome to Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Bobby Pominville and I'm your arts reporter. And today we're going to focus on poetry. And I have invited as my guest today Lee Kisling. Welcome to the show, Lee.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, Lee actually started out in a different career, and lately he's been studying creative writing and especially poetry. But although he has been writing for quite a few years, we'll talk about that. But let's start this way. How did you get started writing poetry, and what inspires you to write poetry?
Well, that is a great question, really. I've always written some poems, really, all of my adult life, but never seriously. And it was probably 6 or 7 years ago, I went to a workshop with a man I admire a lot. He's a poet. His name's John Grauber. He lives in Stockholm, Wisconsin. And he had a workshop, and we became pals. I went to the workshop and started writing, and John and the other people in the class seemed to enjoy the poems. So I guess I started producing a little more at that point, and when I retired a year and a half ago from my job, sort of to avoid having to decide what to be when I retired, I went to college. So I've been at Hamline University for going on 2 years now, and it was my chance to really focus on poetry, to learn more about poetry, and of course write, and it's been really wonderful. So that's kind of where I got started, and I write all the time now. I just almost a daily work, and I enjoy it so much.
I think that's just marvelous. You're actually retired into something else, although you probably always had that love within you, and you always probably had the desire to do something more with it, and now you have the time. And I think creative writing is a wonderful, wonderful thing to be doing. And I just would like to encourage everyone to read and write. And one of the things I love to promote on my show is language arts. Mm-hmm. So you're perfect for the show. Mm. So do you want to talk about that first book you wrote?
Yeah, well...
Kind of fun to hear about that.
Okay, the chapbook came out in December last year, 2013, and it was published by the Parallel Press in Madison, and it's got 24 poems in it, and it was a lot of work that I created in the few years before that, so they're a bit dated now, I suppose, but I contacted them. They actually publish a series in Wisconsin of Wisconsin authors. So a lot of well-known folks have trod this road, and I was pretty honored to be part of that. So a lot of excitement when the book came out, and we had a couple of public readings, and it's just really, really rewarding when you actually get your work kind of out and people start looking at it.
Wow. And sometimes I would think publishing could be a bit of a problem. So you were very fortunate. I understand that's with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Libraries.
Right. That's right.
So you were actually chosen to be published.
Right. They selected me, and it was quite wonderful. And yeah, getting published is challenging.
Oh, yes.
So
I'm sure it is. Well, let's talk about your recent studies of creative writing, and tell us how that has led to a desire to write more. Or is that the thing that inspires you, or is it because you're learning more about it, or what do you think?
School's an interesting way to deal with creative writing, because the originality, the impulse, the drive sort of has to come from you. But in college, I went in not knowing very much, to be honest with you. So it was very intensified learning, and it was quite wonderful, because not only did I was kind of a blank slate, honestly. So I learned so much from my professors. But as part of that discipline, you also have to write, and it's quite challenging because you often don't have much time. Like week by week by week, you're supposed to be producing, and it takes a lot of concentration and a lot of effort to do that. So you learn by doing, of course. The more you write, the better you get, hopefully. But you also learn from other people. And to me, this was probably the best part of college, really, because I encountered all of these great poets, that some of whose names I had heard or was familiar with, but not their work, and other ones that, probably almost everyone else knew about that I didn't. So it was discovery, and discovering these people and their terrific poems was just, it was just exciting, and it was wonderful, and I ended up getting a lot of favorites naturally, I think, because a lot of great poets out there, and some from the recent past, and so from that, I liked the whole idea of it more and more, and that was more inspiring to do work. And I think you have a background in the arts too, so you
Yes.
know when you hear a great composition of music,
yes.
you want to go play the piano.
Yes.
When you hear a great poem, you want to go sit down at your desk. And it's an interesting thing about writing, because I often don't know really what I'm writing about until I'm fairly deep into a poem. And that sounds very strange, but really one idea leads to another idea, and a poem begins to take shape, and it's very organic. And writing poetry has as much to do with discovery as it does composition. You're finding out how you feel about something, and you find out by writing. You're discovering how you feel and getting it down, and that's why poetry requires a lot of revision, because you might find halfway through that you thought you were talking about one thing, and really you kind of went somewhere else. So because of that, you kind of have to go then back and redirect things around and choose some different words or images, So it's a very organic process, and I quite enjoy it.
Well, and there was an article recently in the paper, and I learned so much from reading that. And one of the things you said in the paper was you're very sensitive to phrases you hear.
That's true. Many poems begin with a phrase, or even a word, or just a thought. And I don't presume to be typical of other people. I don't really know, but often for me, in those moments between sleeping and waking, like when you've just gone to bed or when you've just awakened, there's a lot of traffic, so to speak, between your conscious and your subconscious, and things will occur to you, and you're awake enough to think about them. And it's at times like that I get a lot of words or phrases, and I will linger in that time and consider them and think about what they mean and what they sound like, or sort of recast them to say something slightly different. And often when I write a poem, I am starting with a phrase and just seeing where it goes, and sometimes it doesn't go anywhere.
I think that's kind of neat, because there's lots of things that I find very interesting when I'm reading or listening to a show or something. And then I also loved this. You said poetry is similar to music, sound with tone and rhythm. And of course, that spoke to me, because music is my main area of study.
Right.
And it's true. And actually, music compositions often do combine with poetry and lyrics.
Yeah, and
So I like that idea too.
And I agree with that completely, because it's not only the content of the words, it's the sound of the words, and it's the meter of the words, and it's even the shape of a poem on a page. Is it a big box? Is it kind of a long, narrow kind of looking thing? And the shape of poems matters too. But I'm a real believer in sound, having grown up around music myself. So The part of poetry is oral. It translates better, I believe, as does music when it's played live. So with poetry, I think it's best to be heard, or to speak it yourself, to recite it out loud. And you're hearing not only the words, but you're hearing the sound of the words.
Right. It's a real experience. Well, I also read about your putting together a personal anthology of poetry. And I thought, how interesting.
Oh, yeah.
So I want to hear about that.
Well, you see, I think almost every poet that I know does this. It's because the work that you read by famous people or just extremely talented people, you just got to hang on to it. And so what I do is I collect it, and I put it in a notebook. And that's my own personal anthology. And that way, almost everything that I love in a poem is in that one place, and I can go to it. And most poets do this. It'd be like a musician keeping the scores of their old sheet music. You've probably moved on and play other things, but you know where that is. Your special place where you keep that kind of stuff. And
yes.
So an anthology, very special and important part of the work.
Now, how did you decide? It's something you really intensely like, and then you're going to put that in your anthology.
How do I decide what I like?
Yes.
Well,
is it just something? It sounds like an awful lot, 60, but probably not.
Well, in this workbook for the workshop, I selected 60 poems.
Oh, that's right.
But in the anthology at home, there's more than that, actually.
Okay.
So I prepared a workbook for this poetry workshop I'm teaching right now, and it's got about 60 poems by other folks in it.
Oh.
And those poems were kind of selected not only because they're favorite poems in mine, I really like them, but they also serve to illustrate one of the points that we're talking about in the lessons in the class. So
I see, and we're going to get back to that in a little while because we want to hear about your workshop. But Lee, you have graciously agreed to read some poetry today. And let's take time right now for your first reading. And we'd like you to tell us about it, if you would.
All right, I'm going to read two poems today. They both are quite new, less than 3 weeks old probably. So they may suffer from not having aged. A poem has to age like wine, I think, but these are fairly new, so this is probably their first trip in the public. So
wonderful.
The first poem is called "The Difference Between Flotsam and Jetsam," and I care a lot about words and what they mean. You'd be amazed how often I go to the dictionary because I want to know exactly what something means, and choosing the correct words is important to me. So. The difference between flotsam and jetsam. Over the side with the jetsam, not worth carrying anymore. It gets in the way, a tripping hazard. This you suspected years ago, but found always a special secret place to stow it, to bring it, to knead it. Stuff with no tongue. It doesn't say good morning or I love you. Not a wink or a purr or a touch, still withholding. The problem is that even when you throw it overboard, some of it floats. And that, you see, is the flotsam. What I have wondered is, did she toss the poems? Eventually, everything gets thrown out, gets waterlogged and sinks. 1,000 verses litter the sea. The ink runs. Desire wades ashore in tatters. Love lost. More than a storm, a tormenta. Then the sea, like glass, empty. Or did she keep them? Folded. At the back of a shelf in the poets' area, behind the hats. Me and the other fellow. In the deepest night, we whisper our stories box to box. There was a time, I say. Oh yes, I hear. There was a place, a drink, a laugh, a kiss. How many? Oh, I couldn't say, he lies. I held her hand, oh, but not for long. I have a photo somewhere, in the half-light of a half-moon. We are brothers, I say. Half-brothers, he says. And in case any of this matters, one day a small white hand comes for him and takes him, I think, to the river.
Oh my. Now that, I would really like you to explain that a little bit. Could you?
Well, certainly.
Because you've gotten a little into something kind of deep there, and I didn't get it from hearing the poem, but I know you told me a little bit more about it.
Right. What's going on is, this is a poet that's remembering a lost love. Mm-hmm. And the image of the flotsam and jetsam, it would be like you and I moving on in our lives. We're moving on, we're getting rid of that old stuff, but some stuff it's hard to get rid of. And some stuff you always keep, or if you try to throw it away, it floats, maybe. Mm-hmm. So then the poem shifts to him wondering about that. Mm-hmm. Did she keep the poems, his poems? And then he's a little depressive about that, maybe. Well, everything gets thrown away. But he's not really satisfied with that as an answer, so he imagines she kept them, and they're in a box, in her closet, on a shelf. Mm-hmm. Well, at that point, the poem becomes a little surreal. So these two poets, or their poems, maybe, in the two boxes, talk to one another. And you heard the dialogue.
Yes.
And it's somewhat competitive, even to the last line, where he imagines the lost love coming and taking the other fellow and throwing him overboard.
I think that's delightful.
Thank you.
I love the thought of it. And very well done.
Thanks.
Excellent. Well, now we're going to switch gears because in a little bit he's going to read another poem. And I love that you're bringing two things to read. I wanted to go back to you're offering a free 7-week poetry workshop somewhere in Hudson.
Yeah, it's at the Hudson Library. It's on Thursdays.
Oh, perfect.
It has started already now, so we're at week 2. If anyone was interested, they could still come.
There would still be time because, well, tell us what day and so on, what time.
Well, it's at 6:30 p.m. at the Hudson Area Library here in Hudson. Mm-hmm. And it runs until 8 o'clock, and then they turn off the lights, and that's our signal to stop and leave.
Really?
There's a group of about 9 people, and it's an introduction to poetry. So the folks attending the class are in some ways new to the study of poetry. So in the lessons for the class, we talk about metaphor and voicing, and then we read poems that help to illustrate what it is that we're studying.
Right.
And there's also an emphasis on the people attending the class in writing poetry. So it's an opportunity each week to bring in a poem, and then we as a class can workshop it. And in order to get that done, we're going to do in-class exercises, some brief writing exercises, or I also send them home with an assignment of a writing exercise of a kind.
Oh, wonderful.
And they have the option, not the requirement, but if they want to, they can bring work in, and I'm hoping they will.
Oh,
So,
that's just wonderful.
yeah, it's going to last 7 weeks.
7 weeks.
If it's popular enough and there's a desire for it, we'll repeat it later on. So
Good. I think that's just marvelous. I don't know of anything like that going on, and I think it would speak to a lot of people.
I hope so.
And so you're really achieving a lot during that because you're teaching, you might say, the rudiments of poetry.
Right. There's a lot of mysterious things about poems, and some people are put off by that. But when people start writing poetry, almost in every case, what they discover is is that there are things going on in their own minds that they weren't really aware of until they start putting them down. And the more you do it, the better you get at that. And so having the workshop with a lot of poems by other folks to read helps people to learn about how to use images and how to use sound. And so we look at the poems and we kind of look at famous poems, and we will study them, and I'll point out kind of what's going on in the poem and some skill or technique that doesn't always immediately meet the eye when you read a poem. So major opportunities to learn here and also practice.
That's wonderful. I think that's just marvelous that you're doing that. So great thing that you're offering there. Okay, now we're going to the second reading.
All right.
So please tell us about that.
This poem's also brand new. One of the things I've been studying is an odd word. It's called ekphrasis. And what ekphrasis refers to is poetry that's been written in response to an image. Like typically it's a painting. You might be inspired by a Rembrandt or a Leonardo painting or something and write a poem about it. And there are many ways that this can come out. You can be in conversation with the painter, or you can be in conversation with the subject of the painting, or you can be rhetorical and wonder about the production of the painting, the color, the shapes, and so on and so forth. And ekphrasis has become quite popular. It's quite old. It's been going on for several hundred years. And one of the artists that I admire enormously is a poet no longer living. Her name was Elizabeth Bishop. And I really came to love her poetry. And then I read some biographies about her, and I sort of came to love her as well. So then I discovered that she was also a painter. And the more I studied about ekphrasis, I wanted to try it. I wanted to experiment with it. So this is an experiment. It's one of Elizabeth Bishop's paintings. And the painting is called Daisies in Paint Bucket. What sort of paint was it in the old bucket, I mean? Here, years later, and miles from springtime, my affectionate gestures of tenderness and style have overshot the mark again. A representation of daisies. My life, a representation of a life. The trouble is, I can feel your happiness when I look at this flamboyant array, but I also detect sorrow and evasion. It's a love story, I think. Does this painting carry a blessing, as is said of all love stories? Does it carry other things, like surprise or confusion? And how long do blessings last? Forever? The euphoria of picking daisies in the field, carrying them like a bridal bouquet to the house, laughing about that. The old paint bucket seems right. The bucket seems impromptu, earthy, but also comic, too humble and sad. Me, I would have called the painting Old Paint Bucket, in order to solicit pity from every wounded man and woman in the universe, to which I would respond with a monumental shrug and a half smile. Daisies, like fireworks. I will always love you, Elizabeth, and your artful daughters, their daisy cover-ups, their solemn choices, and their footprints filling with snow.
That's very beautiful.
Thank you.
Now, that's a pretty heavy subject. It almost makes me feel like you've experienced something.
Yeah, there's part of my story in here, for sure.
That's what I was thinking when you were reading both of those poems. You have to share part of yourself almost.
I think you do, and honestly, one of my favorite things about poetry is a concept called voice. And what voice refers to is not only the word choice that you employ, but the sound of the words and so on. I have this belief that with any really good poem, when you hear the poem read or you read the poem, if it's carefully written, you can kind of see through the poem to the writer. Some people strongly disagree with this.
Really?
Yeah, but you think of back to music again. When you hear a certain kind of music, I think it's probably similar. That you can kind of see the artist, the composer. You get some sense of them just by the tone
Yes.
and substance of their work. So a strong voice happens when a poet is being honest or talking about something that's important to them. Something to do with values or fears, even obsessions, their loves or what have you. If you can detect those things, you can see through to the artist. And you don't know everything about them. You may not know what they look like or whatever, but you get a sense of them. So in my work, I guess I would say that it's always, if it's got a strong enough voice, you can see through to me, even though I'm hiding out a little bit.
Right.
And we all do. I can't tell you everything and shouldn't and
No.
don't want to, and you don't want to hear it. But I can choose to tell you certain things
Yes.
about
Little bits and
what
pieces.
what I have
interesting.
experienced, how I feel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that kind of came through, really. And then I thought it was quite interesting when you were using the name Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, yeah. Well, if this poem would ever be published, it would say right by the poem that it was based on this painting by Elizabeth
Oh,
Bishop.
yes. Well,
So,
that would be perfect.
She had a difficult life, and I think some of that comes out in the
really?
in the poem because there are mixed emotions going on here, opportunities, missed opportunities, love story. Love stories are complicated, and so on. And then there is my part that sort of creeps in too, because I identify with her life and her love stories and her feelings. So.
Yes, and I think that's probably the secret to being creative and imaginative and getting into that idea of what was it like for her. And then you really did express that very well.
Thank you.
I can see where you'd be a good teacher.
I love teaching.
It's great fun. I have to say, and when people are interested in your subject matter,
Yeah.
there's nothing better.
Well, last week I was at the high school. I was talking to AP English classes in
Yes.
Hudson, and it was amazing. It was just amazing. Really? You know how teenagers are rather exuberant in the first place. They bring so much energy, and they became so attentive, and they wanted to hear. They wanted to hear real stories about real sorrow, about real emotions expressed, the hunger for a real experience of life, and it was great fun to share with them. And I see that with the people in the workshop too. You start talking about a poem and trying to pull out what they're getting at with the devices they're using in the poem. People just wake up and they consider that, it's almost a revelation. And the art does that to you.
It does.
Yeah.
And what I see in you is that you have taught them to respond, and in doing that, they have become better at doing what they're trying to do, which I assume is writing poetry or understanding poetry.
Right.
And that's a very wonderful goal for you.
Yeah.
And isn't it nice when they do respond and you have that feedback and it's so immediate?
Yeah.
And how wonderful. You've got to share. When you can share what you've learned and then share your work.
Yeah,
It's so important to do that.
yeah, it's a bit risky, but
Oh yeah, because you could fail.
and honestly, you expose yourself.
That's true.
So, what kind of person are you? You know, and it's fairly, you're pretty
very
exposed. And there's another scary idea about poetry, really, and that is that the quality of the work, to some degree, is directly related to the quality of the person. So,
Wow.
you know, anyone can write a narrative of words about how they feel, but
True.
and what they have experienced. But it's more how you react to what you have experienced. And I'm not saying I'm a quality person. This is not about egotism. It's about when you really do succeed in your work,
Yes.
you're telling something pretty close to the bone. It's something that you care about a lot, and you can be ever so abstract if you want to, but if it's a truth-telling kind of experience,
Right.
people generally don't have much trouble understanding where you're coming from.
That's really what it's all about. And if you can reach people and share these things with them, you've come a long ways.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's another interesting part about that, and much poetry has to do with processing sorrow and loss. It's just a fact. We
I
know.
imagine it
we know
is.
this.
Yes.
But on the other hand, there is a certain delight in being able to do that, and there's healing in it, and there's communion with other people between writer and reader.
Oh yes, definitely. Wow. I hadn't really thought that much about it, but I can see where it's very effective. Very effective. Now, somebody might want to get in touch with you about that workshop. Can you leave something here so we can put it on the screen?
For sure. We'll leave an email address, or they can call the Hudson
Okay.
Area Library, and
Well, that's true.
I
They can contact the library.
I can be found.
And just remind me again, did you say Wednesday?
Thursday
Thursday
evening,
6:30.
6:30 until 8.
And you've got how many more lessons?
6 more.
6 more. So I suppose it'd be most helpful if they'd come this week
That would be probably good.
or soon.
Yeah.
So they can really get in on the teachings.
And I would need to know so that I can prepare a workbook for them, too.
Oh, right.
So they get to keep that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, that would be good. So we would ask people to contact you then.
Yeah, feel free.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show today.
It's been great fun.
I just learned to know you on the telephone, and I just feel like we had a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I love talking
Thank
about
you
it.
so much.
Thanks.
And I do want to thank you for tuning in today, and I hope that you were inspired and would delve into some poetry yourself and perhaps consider a workshop. So thank you for listening today.